Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Knife Chats with Tobias. So I received a comment on one of my videos about the Air Force survival knife. Now, if I say Air Force survival knife, I bet you there's a picture that comes to your mind of what knife I'm talking about. In any case, the comment reads, "There's no such thing as a USAF survival knife. The original knife was a 6-inch blade requested by the USN for the first generation jet fighters. They had a high accident rate and needed an escape tool. It was eventually adopted by the USAF, USCG, USMC, and USA Aircrews." So first he says there's no such thing as a USAF survival knife, and then he says that the USN knife was later adopted by every branch. So in theory, he is contradicting himself right away, because he is saying that the survival knife that was adopted or that was contracted for by the Navy ends up being adopted by every branch, including the Air Force, so you could in theory call it an Air Force survival knife, which is the common phrase that everyone says when they're looking at this knife. They'll either call it the Air Force survival knife, the jet pilot knife, or the aircrew survival knife. In theory, I think he's right. There is no such thing as an Air Force survival knife. That is not the official name of the knife. That is not what it's called. Marbles, when Marbles first came out with the knife, this is not by Marbles, this is by Camillus. It did have a 6-inch blade. However, when the Navy was contracting for this knife, or came out with the specifications for this knife, it wasn't suddenly something new that they needed for their jet pilots. The need for a knife for pilots and aircrew actually came about during World War II, and it was basically the Army Air Force that first recognized an issue with this, and they started looking at a way to solve the problem. And what came up was, it was actually began in the United Kingdom, because they realized that if a pilot was actually shot down and survived the crash or survived parachuting out of the aircraft, about 80% of them would die afterwards or be captured. And they needed to come up with programs and equipment to aid in a pilot's survival and ability to return to service after being shot down. The Air Force quickly recognized this issue too, and they actually started a program in World War II to look at ways to increase the survivability rate of pilots once they were shot down. And around the same time, the Navy also started doing that. And one of the things that both the Army Air Force and the Navy recognized was that their pilots needed a knife, and they needed something that would be functional after getting shot down and everything. And for the Air Force, the Army Air Force, and even the Navy at first, the idea was to just grab hunting knives that were already in stock, and that's happened throughout World War II, that a lot of soldiers were just issued hunting knives. And the Army Air Force basically focused on 2 knives. That was this one, the RH-36. The Navy also used the RH-36, and it was often stamped USN. The Navy also used a Mark I knife. Now the RH-36 had a 6-inch blade, but the Air Force, or the Army Air Force, also adopted a 5-inch bladed knife from Camillus. Both of these served in both Europe and in the Pacific. Now, the Navy also came out with the Mark I knife that was used by not only pilots and aircrew, but all sorts of other people in the Navy also were issued the Mark I knife. I don't have an example of that, I'm sorry. So the idea of we need a knife for our pilots started in World War II. Okay, so now let's fast forward to the Korean War. It's now 1951, and both the Navy and the Air Force have recognized that we need new knives because all those ones that we had from World War II, they're really getting worn out and they're getting lost, and we need to get new knives to replace them. Now, the Navy was using the Mark I knife, but they were looking for something a little more useful, something that was a little more purpose-made for their pilots, and that's where this knife came out around 1954. Now, this is, like I said, this is one by Camillus, and this is one from around 1957 to 1961, but it looks essentially the same as what the Marbles knife looked like, and that was the one that was adopted by the U.S. Navy. Now, Marbles only made 500 of those for the U.S. Navy, and it became a knife that the entire Department of Defense was interested in for all their pilots. And so they took that same knife and they basically took the contract to Camillus in 1957. And that's when Camillus started making these knives in bulk numbers, a lot bigger numbers than what was being used by the Navy. And that's when it became basically military-wide, a knife that was being issued to pilots regardless of service, Navy, Air Force, Army, and it was a very popular knife. But now let's step back a second, because one of the things that the message here says is there is no such thing as a USAF survival knife, and that in itself is technically wrong. There was a knife that the United States Air Force adopted that no other branch of the military used, and it was used for a short time until this knife replaced it. And that knife is this knife right here. This is the Boker 155, which became known as the Air Force's E1 knife, or Emergency 1 knife. It is basically just a small bird and trout knife, and this knife was something that fit the bill that General Curtis LeMay came out with for his Strategic Air Command. He wanted a knife, a small handy knife that he could give to his bomber crews for SAC. And this is often referred to as the SAC knife, but this was a knife that was contracted by the Air Force, and the Air Force bought a good number of them to equip SAC crews. So this was the original Air Force survival knife. However, it was never really called the Air Force survival knife. It was just known as the E1. Now, obviously, this was not a knife designed for fighting or anything. It was really for living off the land. And it was actually, the idea was you would be using this when you ended up in the frozen tundra of the North, because that's where they expected most of the SAC pilots to get shot down, in, the tundra of Russia or in Canada or someplace like that. And so this knife was really just something for survival, as in small game, cutting up and everything. It was not designed for fighting or anything like that. Was the knife successful? Well, it would meet the needs of what the Strategic Air Command had in mind, but it might not have been the same kind of knife that the pilots and air crew were interested in, because, well, this knife looks like something that might work a little bit better for self-defense. So the Air Force also was looking for something else after that knife was even adopted. And this knife, the SAC knife, was adopted around 48, 49, somewhere around there. And then by the time 1957 or so rolls around, the Air Force is also like every other branch of service. They're looking at getting rid of all these old knives that they had and replacing them, just kind of like the same way the Navy was. And so in 1957, the Department of Defense puts in a contract for these knives, and this knife is going to replace all the knives for the air crew and stuff. Now, when Marbles first came out with this knife, like I mentioned, this is one by Camillus. This was made from 1957 to around 61 or so. The Marbles knife came out in 1954. It was kind of a one and done contract. Not that Marbles wanted it to be a one and done contract, but the Department of Defense decided it was going to be a one and done contract. A lot of politics probably involved in that. I don't know for certain. But in any case, Marbles referred to this knife as the jet pilot knife. Now, did the Department of Navy call it the jet pilot knife? I don't know. What I do know is that by 1957, the knife was known as at least the pilot survival knife. It was not called the Air Force survival knife or anything like that, and it might have been called the jet pilot survival knife, but I seriously doubt at that time they would have been calling it the jet pilot knife, because this was being issued to all branches of service, including a couple branches of services that don't have jets, one of them being the Army. And these knives were actually being issued to helicopter crews. So this knife with the 6-inch blade, the Camillus pilot's knife, was being issued to the Air Force, it was being issued to the Army, it was being issued to the Navy, it was being issued to everyone. If you were in, Coast Guard was even getting them, like the letter had mentioned. And it was the pilot survival knife. At least that's the civilian term. I hear about it so often. I don't know exactly what the military was calling it at the time. What I do know is that shortly around 61, 62 or something, the knife loses an inch of its blade. Now, why it lost an inch of the blade? Well, there's a lot of debate on exactly where that happened. It wasn't something that Camillus decided to do just to make it a less expensive knife, save an inch of steel on the blade. It wasn't anything like that. From what I understand, the military, different branches, I'm not sure who, basically said the blade was too long. And I suspect that it was most likely helicopter pilots, but it might have also been Air Force pilots or Navy pilots also complaining about it, because that extra inch, when you're wearing it on your survivors or your vest, the vest that you're wearing in your jet and your helicopter and everything else, you've got it there and it's long. That extra inch is actually hitting stuff in a very crowded cockpit, and so they wanted a shorter blade, so they ended up with a 5-inch blade on it. Now, I suspect that might have been the helicopter pilots. I don't know for certain. In which case, then this would be a Army survival knife instead of an Air Force survival knife, because this is their modification to it. But if the Air Force made that final modification of shortening the blade, then maybe it's an Air Force survival knife. I don't know. And the thing is, the official name for this knife is knife hunting. The longer name for it is knife hunting sheath survival pilot. So that's the full name of it. So you will often hear it referred to as a jet pilot knife or an air crew knife or the Air Force survival knife. And when it comes to Air Force survival knife, that is probably the most common name you hear for it out there in the world. And then there is a replacement for it, which is the ASEK. This knife has been around for a while. It's made by Ontario. It's the ASEK. People also will refer to this as the Air Force survival knife, but this knife also was not contracted by the Air Force. This was actually done to specs that were drawn up by the United States Army. The Army wanted this knife for their air crew, and it ended up getting adopted also by the Air Force. Most people just refer to this one as the ASEK, and then they'll refer to this one as the pilot knife or the jet pilot knife. Now, ASEK actually stands for Air Crew Survival and Egress Knife, and there's a lot of stuff going on with that name and everything. It is basically a little bit bigger than the original one. It's got a shorter blade but a bigger handle, if you can notice there. So it comes out a little bit bigger. In any case, not a big deal. The ASEK knife, like I mentioned, was made by the Army, but the Air Force ended up adopting it. Why would they do that? Well, this knife is also still in use with the Air Force. The Air Force, it's interesting, the Air Force doesn't really quibble about the smaller items in their inventory, the small arms and stuff like that. They adopt a knife that another branch of service has already proven. One of the exceptions to that is probably the M16 rifle. The M16 rifle, the Air Force was the first branch of service to use it, and the only reason the Air Force ended up using the M16 rifle is because they were still using, they bought them for their security forces, their on their missile silos and stuff. Basically, they had their security forces were armed with M1 carbines. The M1 carbines were from World War II. They were definitely dated. They were old. They were worn out, and they needed something new. So they went and looked off the shelf, and they bought a bunch of AR-15s from from Armalite, and replaced their carbines with it. And then the Army basically saw the AR-15, thought, wow, that's pretty cool. And they had already kind of looked at it a little bit. And the Army decided, we're going to adopt that, but this is what you got to do, Colt. You've got to do this, 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 and this. And the Air Force basically said, you don't need to do any of that stuff. These rifles are just fine. But the Army said, no, we're not going to adopt it unless you do this, 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 and this. And the Air Force said, I don't care. They shrugged their shoulders, said, do whatever you want to do. We'll buy them after you adopt them. And so the Army adopts the M16 with all of its changes, one of them being that little forward assist. The early M16s that the Air Force used did not have a forward assist. They never bothered with it. And as they replaced them, they ended up with the Army's version with the forward assist and the new flash hider and all the other stuff. But that's the way the Air Force is, and it was the same way with the knife. The Air Force, technically, no, they do not have an Air Force survival knife. Now, I know a lot of you are saying, well, you get upset when they call the Marine combat knife a K-bar. And it's like, well, no, I get upset about that because if the knife is made by Camillus, it's a Marine combat knife. That's really what the knife is. K-bar is a brand. I would be just as upset if someone were to say the Camillus survival knife, if everyone were calling this the Camillus survival knife, because this, I could easily say, is a Camillus pilot survival knife. But this knife is an Ontario survival knife. It's not by Camillus. So that's the difference between why I have an issue with people calling every combat knife, that 7-inch fighting knife, a K-bar, because a lot of companies made it. This is different. I don't have an issue with somebody referring to it as an Air Force survival knife. If someone were to say this is a Navy survival knife, fine, go for it. Most people are going to be a little confused and they're going to think, wasn't that the Mark I? But why Air Force survival knife? Why does this knife often get referred to as Air Force survival knife? I mean, this one, the one with the 6-inch blade, is normally by collectors referred to as the jet pilot knife, especially if it's by Marvels. It's almost always referred to as the jet pilot knife. We saw that Camillus actually calls this the pilot knife. They don't refer to it as the Air Force survival knife. But even back in the 80s, this was being called the Air Force survival knife. Now, the ASEK does not have that problem. It is usually referred to as the ASEK. Some people you'll hear it referred to as the new Air Force survival knife or something like that. But ASEK actually says ASEK on the handle, so most people will refer to this as an ASEK, and they do that to make it clear that it's the ASEK and not this knife. So that really still doesn't answer the question about this one being called the Air Force survival knife. And, especially if supposedly it has its roots with the Navy, well, maybe that's part of the reason, because even this knife, I mean, they call it the jet pilot knife, but the Navy is proud to say that we don't have pilots, we have aviators. Only the Air Force calls the people who drive their planes pilots. We are aviators, we're not pilots. So maybe that's part of it. They've divorced themselves from the word pilot, so the jet pilot knife, people assume Air Force. Not to mention Air Force pilots in Vietnam were carrying this knife, and they were jet pilots, not aviators. But also helicopter crews were carrying this. Why isn't it called the Army helicopter survival knife? Again, I think even then it was sometimes referred to as the air crewman's knife or something like that. In any case, everything about it kind of leans towards somebody flying a plane, and most people who are flying planes are in the Air Force, at least in the military. The Air Force flies a whole lot more planes than anybody else. This is the knife that most people will come across. Either this, well, it used to be this knife all the time. Now more so they come across the ASEK when they're going through the SEER training, the survival, escape, resistance, and evasion course. And that's run by the Air Force. So these knives are the knives you see first. You'll see this one. You used to see this one all the time. The Air Force was running the program, so most people, when they first saw this, they would see this, and it would be the survival knife that the Air Force uses, so Air Force survival knife. Maybe that was the reason, but it could also just come down to the fact that so many retailers referred to it as the Air Force survival knife, and it's a term that people have become very familiar with, very accustomed to. It is a very generic term for a knife, and any of the knives, rather it be by Camillus, rather it be in Ontario, rather it be mil-spec, or something made in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, if it looks like this, people just call it an Air Force survival knife. And I think that's really what it comes down to. So is it truly an Air Force survival knife? Well, we already covered that. This is actually knife, hunting, sheath, survival, pilot. So if you want to call it that, go ahead, call it that. People kind of look at you kind of strange. But if you say Air Force survival knife. So yeah, a lot of people just call it the Air Force survival knife. Now this one's by Camillus, so if you call it the pilot knife, you're probably a little more accurate if you call it the pilot survival knife, because that's what Camillus called it. I believe Ontario at one time called it the air crew survival knife. That was before the ASEK came out. So that's also a more accurate term than Air Force survival knife. But if you call it an Air Force survival knife, people know what you mean. Now, some people will be upset with it and say that there's no such thing as an Air Force survival knife. But in my book, yeah, this is the Air Force survival knife. It's a generic term for any knife that looks like this. I'll let you go now. Let me take just a second to thank you once again for dropping by and spending a few minutes here at Knife Chats with the Pious. I really do appreciate it, and I do appreciate any comments that you leave. So please remember to give me that thumbs up, and also don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'll know when the next episode is up and running. Thanks again for dropping by. Really do appreciate your time here.